Hello everyone, this is Tech with Beck, and I'm here to walk you through how to create a simple but powerful inventory application with React and Material UI. This is both a great portfolio project for anyone looking to sink their teeth into React, but also demonstrate some key JavaScript concepts. Material UI is an amazing library for customizable React components. Their documentation is great, and utilizing a front-end library like Material UI takes the headache out of user interface development. In this inventory application, you'll be able to add an item to the inventory table, edit and update the item, view the item in a read-only state, and delete the item. I want to preface that like most things in coding, there are so many different ways you can code something to achieve the same result. This video is just one way you can create this application. You can do a similar setup with other programs like Vite, but I created the initial setup of this application with Create React App. I'll put a link in the description to the Create React App website for setup instructions. After deleting a lot of the boilerplate code from the Create React app, I'm left here with this App.js file, and that's where I'll start to add everything. So first I'll make placeholders for some of the imports, so the first one being the React information, things from Material UI, and then later on my components. From React, I'll just be importing the useState hook. Then from Material UI, we'll use Create Theme, which will help us customize some of the colors with Material UI, because by default, it's usually a purple color. Then we'll import the grid, which will help us center everything and keep things a little more responsive. And also note the Create Theme is from @mui/system, while grid is from @mui/material/grid. Next, we're going to create a const for our theme, and this will basically initialize our theme via the create theme that we just imported from Material UI. We then want to start making some different styles for the different components that we'll be making. And in Material UI, one way to do it is to create different constants. So first we'll create a const for the button grid style, which I'll be demonstrating later. Then a constant for the text field style. And then another one for the icon style. So for the button grid, we want to first give it a margin top with a theme.spacing of 2, which is basically a set spacing for Material UI. And then we want to give the margin on the bottom for a spacing of 2 as well. Then for our text fields, we want to give the top margin of a spacing of 2. Then we want to give the minimum width of those text fields of 60%, and this will help it be more responsive compared to giving it a set width. Then for our icons, we want to give the top margin of a spacing of about 0.25, so that way it just has a little bit of margin and nothing too far away. Let's give it a left margin of 0.5. And then finally a right margin of 0.5 as well. Now that we've created the style constants, we'll then want to make sure everything is centered at all times. That's when we'll add in the Material UI grid component and add the container and justify content as center, along with align items as center. Now you can see I also created a components folder, which is where all of our component files will be listed. And the first file we'll want to create is the new item dialog file. And that's the component that will come up once we click the add button and to then enter all the information in for the new item that we're adding to the inventory table. We'll then want to make sure the app.js file can reference the new item dialog. To do that, we'll import new item dialog from / the components folder and then / again for the new item dialog. Now that we've imported that component, we can then add the new item dialog in between the two grid component tags. By doing this, anything in between the grid component tags will be centered. We'll want to make sure that the new item dialog can reference the same styles listed here on the App.js folder. So to make sure that the new item dialog can reference them, we'll want to pass them down as props. You can technically call them anything you want, but to keep it simple, let's just call them the same names we have listed here. So to do that, we'll just say icon style equals icon style, and then the same thing for text field style. Now we'll start importing similar things that we use for the app.js file for the new item dialog. We'll import the useState from React, and then we'll import the grid component from Material UI. And I'll explain to you why in a little bit why I'm using curly brackets and a different folder path than I did for app.js. We want to make sure everything in our new item dialog box is centered and also in a column formation. And that's where we'll use grids similar to how we did in app.js. But in this case, we'll use the grid container and direction equals column. Then we'll want to justify the content as center and then align the items as center. Next, we'll want to create the add button, and we can import the button component from Material UI. And this is where the curly brackets come in handy. So instead of having multiple lines for each import, the curly brackets allow us to add everything in one space as long as we make sure that it's from @mui/material. Now that we've imported the button component, we can place that component in between the grid component tags and call it add. To ensure the button can be both outlined and colored, we'll give it the variant of contained. To start adding styles to the button, there are a few different ways we can do it in Material UI. One way is via the SX prop. And to do that, we'll just pass the button grid style props from our app component. And the reason why you see a red line under props is because we haven't quite passed the props yet in the functional component. So we'll just go up above and add props next to new item dialog. Now we have our first opportunity to utilize our useState hook. So I created a const called dialog new, which will have the state of if our dialog box should be open or closed, and the set dialog new, which will be the function that will change our dialog new from false to true. So I set the default state as false. While we can probably just use the set dialog new function for anything that has to do with the dialog new const, I'll show you how to create a function here. So we'll call it toggle dialog new, and we'll just call the set dialog new function and to set it to be the opposite of whatever the state is for dialog new. So if it's false, it'll just go to true, and if it's true, it'll go to false. Now we can go back to our button component and add an onClick action. So when we click the button, we'll just call the toggle dialog new function, which will change the dialog new state from false to true, and if we were to click it again, from true to false. Now we can start adding the Material UI components of the dialog. So we'll go back up above and add the dialog content, and the dialog actions from MUI/material. We can now go back to below the grid and below the button as well and start adding the dialog tags. And then in between the dialog tags, we'll want to add the content, otherwise known as the dialog content tags. And then to know if the dialog box is open or not, we can add the open equals to the state of dialog new. And then if the dialog box either gets closed by clicking out of it, that will be referred to as onClose, in which we can call the toggle dialog new function as well. We want to start adding text fields and information to the dialog content. And to do that, we first need to add the states of the different text fields, like the name, quantity, and more. So first I'll create a name as a const and use it as set name, and have the initial state as an empty string. I'll copy and paste that a few times to match the number of text fields that I'll eventually need. So the second one will be quantity, and that function could be set quantity. The next text field can be the description. We'll call that set description. And finally the location, and we'll just call it setLocation as the function. Now we can start adding the text field. So we'll import the text field from Material UI, then we'll add it to the dialog content. So we'll add that component, then we'll give that text field a label. So the first one will be name, and then we want to style it as the props.textFieldStyle that we passed down earlier. We want the variant to be outlined, so that way it's not just an underlined text box, but instead the whole thing outlined. And we want to make sure that the value is the name const that we created. Now anytime we type into the text field, we want it to change to whatever we're typing. So what we'll do, we'll use onChange and use an arrow function, and we'll then use the setName function that we created earlier, and we want to pass the target value of whatever we're typing. And that target value will utilize the setName function to change the state of our name. Now we'll want to do the same for our other text fields. So what I'll do, I'll copy and paste the one from name and change the first text box to description, and change the next function to set description. Then copy and paste the same thing for the location, and ensure that I change that last function to set location. So now we have all three text boxes. Now we want to start adding icons, which will be our plus and minus sign for when changing the quantity. So we're going to import the add icon, but then use it as an alias. So we'll use add as add icon, and then remove as remove icon. And you want to note that this will be from a different location. So this will be from @MUI/icons-material. We'll want the icons to have their own style. So to do that, we can just add a grid component with its own SX props with the button grid style that we created earlier. Now instead of having just those flat icons there, we can import the icon button from Material UI, which will give it that hover-like style that you see from a lot of buttons. So we can add it in between those grid components and give it the same button grid style props. And then in between those icon button components, we can then add the remove icon. I'll copy and paste it and do the same thing for the add icon. I'll go back to the App.js file and make sure that the button grid style is passed along to the new item dialog component. Now looking back to see what we have so far, you'll see that we have the icon buttons but no number between them. So we'll want to add that quantity const in between the remove icon and the add icon. And we'll change the default state from an empty string to 0. Next, we can start creating a function that will change our quantity numbers. On the first icon button where the remove icon is, we'll create an onClick event that will happen anytime we click remove. We'll just input the change quantity function, and we'll pass it the value of -1, and I'll explain that a little bit later. We'll copy and paste that to where the add icon is. And instead of -1, we'll pass a +1. Now going back to our change quantity function, we'll just pass it a variable, and we can call it num. And in this function, we'll want to use our setQuantity function that we created earlier. And we want to take our current quantity const and then add our num value that we passed along. And the reason why we're passing either a -1 or a 1 is because we'll take the quantity and we'll either add a -1, which will decrease the quantity, or add a +1, which will increase the quantity. With our new change quantity function, we'll go back to our new dialog, and by toggling the buttons, we'll see that the quantity goes up and it goes down. But if we keep going past 0, we'll see that it goes to negative numbers, which we don't want for our quantity. So we'll go back to our change quantity function and add it if quantity is currently 0 and the num that we're passing is a -1, then we want it to return nothing and keep the quantity at 0. So we can go back and see that no matter how many times we click the decrease button on the quantity, it's not going to go anywhere below 0. Now we need to add buttons to the dialog box so a user can either cancel out of what they're doing or add an item to the inventory list. So I've gone below where the grid is, right before the dialog content, and added dialog actions, and then I'll add 2 buttons, one for cancel and one for add. And whenever someone clicks the cancel button, we'll want to utilize the toggle dialog new function that we created earlier. So you can see here, after inputting some information and clicking the cancel button, the dialog box will disappear. But you'll also see that if I were to click add again, the information is still there. So we'll need to create a function that will clear all the information that was already entered in once the dialog was closed. We'll call this function clearAll, and in this function we'll want to set the name, description, and location as blank, and then the quantity back to 0. Then we'll just add that clearAll function to the end of the toggle dialog new function. Now you'll see that after entering information in and clicking cancel, all the information will be cleared out. Next, we can start adding things to the inventory table. So I'll create a function called addItem. Just like the cancel button, we'll add another onClick event when clicking add. We'll start with an empty array and then start adding an object to that array, and we can do that by using array.push. So we'll want to add the name, description, quantity, and location into that object. And then after doing that, we can just toggle the dialog box. Now that we have an array of information, we need to put it somewhere so it goes into the inventory table. Since anything related to the inventory table will most likely be referenced across many components, we'll go back to the App.js file. This is where the useState hook will come in handy again. We'll create a const and call it inventory, and then that inventory will be changed anytime we invoke the setInventory function, and we'll use the default value of the inventory as an empty array. We'll then pass along the inventory state and the setInventory function to the child component of the new item dialog, so that way both the inventory and setInventory can be referenced via props. Now back in our addItem function, we'll use the setInventory function that we passed down and use the spread operator to essentially combine anything in our existing inventory table with the new item that we're trying to add. And later on, we'll want a way to quickly identify each individual item, so we'll give that an ID as the key, and the value of it will just be the length of the inventory plus 1. To give you a better look under the hood what's going on, I'll console log the array that we just now created. Back in the browser, I'll open up the console and we can add a new item. I just now realized that the value of the name text box is duplicated across the description and the location. So we'll go back to the file and change the value of each text box so the name can remain the same on the name text box, but the description needs the value of description and location needs the value of location. Now we can input the information about the item and we'll see that none of the information is duplicated across the text boxes like it was before. By clicking the Add button, we can look in the console and see that the array has an ID of 1 with the related information that we typed in for the name, description, quantity, and location. With the array created for the inventory table, we now need to create the inventory table component. So we'll go to Components, create the new inventory table.js, and then import that to the App.js file. Similar to how we reference the new item dialog, we'll want to also reference the inventory table and pass along various pieces of information, the first of which being the inventory state. Now we want to start styling the table. So similar to the icon style, we'll just copy and paste that and rename it to table style. We'll set the width to 75%, and then we'll set the top margin to 2. Then of course we'll pass along that table style to the inventory table. For the inventory.js file, we'll start with the same skeleton like the other components, so we'll use export default function inventory table, but don't forget to pass the props as well. To create the table with Material UI components, we'll need to import the table body, the cell, the container, the head, the row, and finally paper from @mui/material. Now for the icons, we'll import edit as edit icon and then delete forever as the delete icon from MUI/icons-material. And of course, we'll need the icon button from the material library as well. The cells of the table will also need some style. So we'll create a table cell style const and we'll give the color as white and the font weight as bold. We only want the inventory table to appear if there are more than 0 items. To accomplish this, instead of using an if statement, we can use a ternary statement or a conditional statement. And we'll do that by utilizing the 2 ampersand signs, otherwise known as the 2 and signs. So if the props.inventory.length is greater than 0, we'll display information. First, we'll start out with the table container component with the SX props of props.tablestyle, and then we'll give that component of paper as the basis. Next up is the table components, and in between that will be the table head. And we can style the table head directly with the SX props, and we'll give it a background color of whatever you want, but I'll just notate it as #FFC107, which is basically a light orange color. After the table head, it will have a table row component, and then in between that, the table cell. And we'll give that the SX prop of the table cell style. And we'll align this cell to be right oriented, and we'll call that cell name. We can then copy and paste that for the quantity and the location cell. We'll create one more cell which is where the icons will lie. We'll then use a map function on our inventory props, which will allow us to render a row on our table for however many items we have, along with some of the designated item information. We'll start again with a table row component, give it hover props, which gives it a nice little effect if you mouse over the row, and a key of row.name. And then from there, we'll start building out the table cells again. The first table cell can have the name, the next will have the quantity, and the one after that will be the location. When we click on each row, we want to be able to view all the information related to that item. So we can then utilize a function that we'll pass out later called viewItem. And when we call the viewItem function, we'll want to pass the ID associated with that row so we know which item we're looking for. Now we can just copy that onClick event and apply it to the other rows. Now we're going to need some space for the icons on the table, both the edit icon and the delete icon. First, I'll utilize the table cell along with the icon button and edit icon components, and then do the same for the delete icon. Similar to how we'll need a function when viewing the item, we'll need a function as well when editing and deleting the item. We'll just call the first function edit item and the next function delete item. To give the icon some space, we'll just add one more table cell component up above. And now when adding an item, we can see that it shows up on our inventory table. The next step will be to make those edit and delete icons usable. Now that we're back in our App.js file, we'll create functions to delete, edit, and view our item. And for each of the functions, we want to make sure that we're passing the item ID to ensure that we're working with the correct item. To delete an item, all we need to do is take our existing inventory state and filter it down to where the item IDs do not equal to our selected item, which will essentially filter out the item that we selected. And then from there, just call the setInventory function to set the inventory state. Before we start working with the edit and view item functions, we'll want to create a state for whichever item is selected. Similar to the inventory state, we'll create a state called selectedItem, a setItem function, and then set the default to an empty array. For both editing and viewing an item, all we need to do is call our setItem function, take our inventory array, and filter it down to whichever item is selected. Whenever we want to edit an item, we'll want a dialog box to appear with the associated item information. To do that, we'll create a const for our existing dialog box and call it dialog existing. The associated function can be called setDialogExisting, and then we can set the default state to false. Then we can go back to our edit and view item functions and set our existing dialog box to true. To further demonstrate how the delete, edit, and view item functions are working under the hood, I'm going to import the useEffect hook from React. This hook will allow us to do something once the state of a particular variable changes. In this case, we'll base it off of our inventory state and our selected item state. Anything we want to track with the useEffect hook is notated in the square brackets. The first useEffect will be tracking inventory, while the second tracks our selected item state. Before we start testing, we can't forget to pass our delete, edit, and view item functions as props down to our inventory component. Now we can go back to our page and check out the console to see what happens to our inventory state whenever we add an item. After adding an item, it gets added as the first array in our inventory state. Now let's add a second item to the inventory table. You can see that our inventory array length went from 1 to 2 with the addition of our second item. By clicking the delete button, it takes the inventory array length back down to 1 after removing the second item. Now let's add another item and call it item 3 so we can see what happens when we click the edit icon. You can see that our selected item state changed, and it shows that our selected item is in fact the item we clicked on, item 3. Now what if we want an item to be editable only if we click the edit icon, and be in a purely read-only mode if we click on the item row? We can accomplish this by adding a read-only const along with the set read-only function. The default state can be false. So whenever we call the edit item function, we'll set read-only to false. And when we call the view item function, we'll set read-only to true. Now let's make a new component and call it existing item dialog. And just like the other components, import it into our App.js file. Next, we'll create a function called toggle dialog existing, which will close our existing dialog box and clear out our selected item. All we need to do is set dialog existing to false and set item to an empty array. And I'll get rid of those red lines by using the correct spelling for those functions. When using the existing item dialog component in App.js, we'll ensure that we pass down the right props, such as the dialog existing, selected item, and read-only states, the styles, and the toggle dialog existing and set item functions. Back in our existing item dialog.js file, we'll get it set up like the other components and pass down props. Since the existing item dialog is going to be similar to our new item dialog component, we'll copy and paste some of the imports from Material UI that make up the dialog box. Next, we'll create placeholder functions for changing info and editing quantity. The open state of the dialog will be tied to the dialog existing props, and the onClose event can be taken from the toggle dialog existing function that we created earlier. In the dialog content components, we'll set up the same grid props as the new item dialog to ensure everything is centered. We can then take our selected item props and use a map function to display the properties of the item. To make it more unique than the last map function I used, I'll set the key to be the ID of the item. Next, we can go ahead and start creating the text fields. The first text field will be for the item name, with the value of item.name. For the onChange event, we'll pass on the item ID, the description of name, and the value of what we're typing. On Material UI text fields, you can add props to the input element via input props. If one of those props called read-only is set to true, then the text field cannot be edited, which is exactly what we're trying to accomplish. We'll set the value to props.readOnly. Now let's fill out the change info function. We'll pass the ID, field, and value. Our new state const will be equal to our selected item props mapped out. If the selected item equals to the ID passed and the field passed is not quantity, then we want to return our item merged with the value of whatever field we're passing. Otherwise, we're just returning the item unchanged. And then finally, we'll set our item to the new state via props.setItem. To build out the remaining text fields, we'll just copy the name text field and replicate it for the description and location text fields. Don't forget to change the label, value, and field name now that we're passing in the change info function. Similar to our new item dialog, we'll set up the remove and add icons. First with the grid components and grid style to ensure proper alignment. If the item is not in a read-only state, then we want the add and remove icons to appear. In between the two icons will be the value of item.quantity. If the item is in a read-only state, then we just want it to say quantity instead of having the icons appear. Next, we'll add an onClick event for the remove and add icons. We'll utilize the edit quantity function and pass the item ID, the item quantity, and a -1 for the remove icon. The add icon will have the same thing, except a +1 is going to be passed. Let's go back and fill out the edit quantity function. We'll pass in the ID, the original quantity, and a positive or negative number. If the original quantity is 0 and we're passing in a -1, then we don't want to subtract any further. Else, if the selected item ID equals the ID that we're passing, then we want to return our item merged without the value of our updated quantity. And then finally, return the item information and set our item to the new state via props.setItem. The last portion of our dialog box are the dialog actions. We'll want to add some buttons to that dialog. The first button will either be called Close if the item is read-only, or Cancel if it is not read-only. The second button, called Update, will only appear if the item is not in a read-only state. When we click Close or Cancel, we'll call the props.toggleDialog function. When we click Update, we'll call the props.updateItem function and pass along the selected item ID. This update item function hasn't been created yet, so let's go to the App.js file to get that done. In the update item function, we'll pass in the item ID. Then we'll create a variable called existing data and have that equal to our current inventory filtered down to whichever items are not equal to our passed in item ID. We'll then set our inventory to the merged data of our existing data and the selected item's new information. And then finally, we'll set our dialog existing state to false to close the dialog box. The last step is to pass down our update item function to our existing item dialog component as props. Let's go back to our page and see our finished application. We'll add an item, edit and update the item, open the item in a read-only state, we can edit the item once more, and then finally delete the item. There you have it, a workable project to add, edit, and delete inventory. Have any questions or want to see a coding walkthrough on something in particular? Comment below. If you enjoyed this tutorial and learned something, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. You've been watching Tech with Beck.